the ink-black waters of the Solomon Islands. During the dark days of 1942 and 1943 were a graveyard. For the sailors of the United States Navy, entering these narrow channels at night was not just a mission. It was an execution order. Out of the darkness, silent, invisible, and terrifyingly lethal killers would strike without warning. Entire American cruisers and destroyers would suddenly explode, ripped apart by massive detonations that sent them to the bottom of the ocean in minutes. The Americans were blind, outmatched, and dying in the dark. This was the terrifying reality of the Imperial Japanese Navy's night warfare doctrine. Long before the outbreak of World War II, the Japanese military recognized a fundamental truth. They could not match the industrial weight of the United States in a fair, daylight fleet engagement. To counter this numeric superiority, the Japanese spent decades perfecting the art of night combat. They turned the cover of darkness into their ultimate weapon. Their strategy relied on hyper-intense training, specialized optics, and a secret weapon that completely outclassed anything in the American arsenal, the Type 93 long-lance torpedo. Japanese sailors were trained to push their bodies to the absolute limit. They selected lookouts with exceptional night vision, pumping them with high-dose vitamin A, and training them to spot the silhouette of an enemy ship miles away in pitch blackness using massive stabilized binoculars, while American crews relied on primitive, early-generation radar systems that were often confused by the proximity of mountainous islands. Japanese lookouts could visually calculate an enemy ship's course and speed with frightening accuracy, but it was the long-lance torpedo that turned this visual edge into a slaughter. Powered by pure oxygen rather than compressed air, the Type 93 left no telltale wake of bubbles. It was invisible. It traveled farther, faster, and carried a far heavier explosive payload than any torpedo on Earth. It could travel nearly 20 miles at high speed, striking American ships far beyond what the U.S. Navy considered torpedo range. In the early battles around Guadalcanal, Savo Island, Tassafaranga, Cape Esperanza, Japanese put this doctrine to work with devastating efficiency. Their destroyers would slip silently into the bays, launch a massive spread of long lances from extreme range, and turn away without firing a single gun. Minutes later, as the unsuspecting American ships cruised in rigid, linear formations, the ocean would erupt. Only after the torpedoes struck would the Japanese open fire with their guns, using devastatingly accurate star shells and searchlights to finish off the survivors. American commanders were completely baffled. They initially believed they were hitting mines or being attacked by submarines. The rigid, dogmatic, tactical manual of the U.S. Navy was getting its sailors killed. American doctrine dictated that destroyers were secondary assets, permanently tied to the cruiser line to act as a defensive screen. They were forced to steam in long, predictable columns behind the cruisers, masking their own torpedo arcs and surrendering the initiative to the enemy. When the guns opened fire, the flash of American artillery instantly blinded their own lookouts, while the Japanese, waiting calmly in the darkness, used those very muzzle flashes as aiming points. The Pacific War was on the line, and if the U.S. Navy could not figure out how to fight at night, the campaign in the Solomons, and perhaps the entire war, would be lost. The turning point did not come from Washington or from high-ranking admirals sitting in comfortable offices. It came from the frontline innovators who refused to keep dying by the old rulebook. Commanders like Arleigh Burke, Frederick Moosbrugger, and battle-hardened tacticians began to dissect the Japanese methodology. They realized that to defeat the night warfare doctrine, they had to break the rigid chains holding American destroyers to the cruiser lines. They needed a completely new tactical philosophy, one that utilized their growing technological edge, advanced radar, and the newly developed Combat Information Center, or CIC. By 1933, early American radar was a clunky novelty. By 1943, the new SG surface search radar was a weapon of mass destruction. It allowed American ships to look through the dark, through rain squalls, and through smoke screens, plotting the exact movements of Japanese fleets long before any human eye could see them. But radar alone was just data. It required a brain to process it. That brain was the CIC. The U.S. Navy began transforming the interior of its destroyers, creating centralized hubs where radar operators, plotters, and gunnery officers worked in unison, passing real-time information directly to the captain on the bridge. Suddenly, the darkness was no longer a Japanese monopoly. The Americans could see the battlefield with godlike clarity. With this technological leap came a revolution in destroyer tactics. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger pioneered a radical new concept: autonomous destroyer striking forces. No longer would destroyers lag behind cruisers like obedient guard dogs. Under the new doctrine, destroyers were divided into independent offensive groups. When an enemy force was detected on radar, the lead destroyer division would slip ahead into the darkness, completely silent, with their guns cold. They would use their radar to sneak into a perfect flanking position, crossing the enemy's path or catching them by surprise inside narrow straits. The key was to launch their torpedoes first, using the element of surprise exactly as the Japanese had done. But unlike the Japanese, who relied on human eyes, the Americans used radar-directed torpedo directors to calculate perfect, mathematically precise solutions. Only after the torpedoes were in the water and running toward their targets would the second destroyer division, or the trailing cruiser line, open fire with their guns. The gunfire served a dual purpose. It battered the enemy ships and, crucially, it distracted them. While the Japanese commanders were focused on returning fire against the visible muzzle flashes of the American gun line, they would remain completely oblivious to the silent wall of American steel racing toward their hulls through the dark. This was the birth of the modern ambush, a tactical evolution that completely inverted the advantages of the Japanese long-lance doctrine. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the black waters of the Pacific were preparing for a dramatic shift in the balance of power. The ultimate validation of this tactical revolution occurred on the night of August 5, 1943. In the pitch-black waters of Vela Gulf, a Japanese force of 4 destroyers, carrying over 900 troops and supplies to reinforce their garrison on Kalimanjaro, slipped into the narrow strait. They were confident, operating under the assumption that the night belonged to the Emperor's Navy. But waiting for them in the dark was Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, commanding a task group of 6 American destroyers. Moosbrugger did not form his ships into a single, clumsy column. Instead, he split his force into two distinct, highly synchronized units, Division 12 and Division 15, as the Japanese ships steamed forward at high speed. Entirely blind to the danger, Moosbrugger's radar picked them up at a distance of nearly 10 miles. The American crews inside the dimly lit CIC rooms tracked the glowing blips on their screens, feeding precise coordinates to the torpedo tubes. Moosbrugger ordered absolute silence. Not a single gun was fired. Not a single searchlight was turned on. The American destroyers executed a perfect, stealthy approach, turning to present their full broadsides of torpedoes. At a range of less than 4,000 yards, Division 12 unleashed a devastating salvo of 24 Mark 15 torpedoes. For several agonizing minutes, the air was silent. The Japanese destroyers kept moving forward, completely unaware that a wall of explosives was racing toward them. Then the night erupted. 3 of the 4 Japanese destroyers, the Hagikaze, the Arashi, and the Kawakaze, were struck almost simultaneously by multiple torpedoes. The explosions were catastrophic, tearing open their engine rooms and igniting their fuel stores. High-octane fuel and ammunition cooked off, turning the pristine tropical night into a hellish landscape of fire and twisted metal. As the crippled Japanese ships burned, the 2nd American Unit, Division 15, immediately opened fire with their 5-inch guns, raining a relentless torrent of high-explosive shells onto the survivors. The remaining Japanese destroyer, the Shigeru, desperately attempted to return fire and launch its own long lance torpedoes, but it was too late. The American tactical trap had executed perfectly. Within a matter of minutes, 3 Japanese destroyers were sent to the bottom of the Gulf, along with hundreds of soldiers and sailors. The Americans did not lose a single ship. In fact, not a single American sailor was even wounded. The Battle of Vella Gulf was a flawless tactical masterpiece. It proved to the world, and more importantly to the Imperial Japanese Navy, that the United States had mastered night combat. The myth of Japanese invincibility in the dark was shattered forever. This concept was refined to absolute perfection by Captain Arleigh Burke, a man whose aggressive spirit and tactical genius earned him the legendary nickname 31-Knot Burke. Burke understood that speed, surprise, and violence of action were the only true counters to the Japanese doctrine. He taught his captains to abandon all hesitation. His doctrine was simple: strike fast, strike hard, and never let the enemy recover. At the Battle of Cape St. George in November 1943, Burke put his theories into practice with devastating results. Detecting a force of Japanese destroyers on radar, Burke's squadron executed a textbook surprise torpedo attack, sinking to enemy destroyers before the Japanese even realized they were under fire. When the remaining Japanese ships tried to flee, Burke did not break off the engagement. He pursued them relentlessly at maximum speed, using his radar-guided guns to destroy another enemy vessel in the open sea. The Japanese night warfare doctrine, which had reigned supreme in the early stages of the war, was completely obsolete. By combining the technological supremacy of radar and the CIC with aggressive decentralized destroyer tactics, the United States Navy had turned the tables. Japanese crews, once proud of their peerless night vision, found themselves utterly helpless against an enemy that could see them through the dark and strike with mathematical precision from beyond the horizon. The mastery of night combat by U.S. destroyers sealed the fate of the Japanese garrisons in the Solomons, choked off their supply lines, and cleared a direct path for the American advance across the Pacific toward Tokyo.